Hey guys, in today's video, we are going to be looking at how Kasparov deals with the minority attack in the Queen's Gambit declined exchange variation. Okay, today's game, we're going to be looking at a game where Kasparov plays black, and his opponent is none other than Lajos Portisch, one of a legendary grandmaster as well. And this is from the World Cup in 1989. So the reason I chose this game, as we'll see, is I have had other games that I featured, which featured the minority attack. I had a nice one by Karpov. I could put a link to that in the notes, as well as just talk about the minority attack in general. But I realized that a lot of my coverage was based on the person executing the minority attack and not the person defending. So I wanted to, I found this game while I was studying in a good book by Steve Giddens. I'll put a link to that in the description as well. But I thought I'd share it with you because it's very instructive on how to fight against the minority attack. Okay, so D4, D5, or Kasparov is black here. And just as a side note, the Knight F3, Knight F6. The Queen's Gambit Decline is an opening that has been played by nearly every world champion. It's just partly because it's very solid, but it's just something that in your career you might want to try to pick up against D4, at least from just at one point, just to get some exposure to it, and then you'll be following in the footsteps of nearly every world champion. In any case, White plays the exchange variation, and I think you might have seen, I've played this before in games here on the channel, but it's a very common opening, and we'll be leading here shortly to the Carlsbad variation, which I'll show you in a second. But here's just a little deviation from the norm. Black plays knight to a6, and the idea here is that White's strategy, which I will show you in a little bit, or a black strategy, is to trade off these light square bishops. And so normally, we just go back here. Black could usually play something like bishop to e7, and then after e3, knight b to d7, and typically this knight goes to f8 and g6, for example. At least that's the way I play it, but it's actually a very common way to develop. And this light square bishop is kind of on the sidelines for a little bit. So instead, black plays knight to a6, and after a3 plays knight to c7. So does not block this bishop, and we'll see why in a moment. Black plays bishop, or I'm sorry, white plays bishop to b5, which is pretty standard here, pinning this knight. And then black plays something interesting here, g6. And I guess one of the points I wanted to share here is that the idea behind this is that black is going to be able to play bishop to f5 to trade off this light square bishop, and so needs g6 to support it because obviously the queen was covering f5. This may be seen as weakening of these dark squares, but the idea here is that there's always a give and take. And specifically in the Queen's Gambit Decline, you can see there's a lot of different strategies. So even within one opening the exchange variation, we see here that g6 is played, but there's a lot of lines where g6 is not played, where h6 is played. And for example, sometimes these queenside pawns are not moved because white has a plan to castle, move his rook to e8, and in some lines, play his rook up to e6 and then attack the king side along this third rank. So these pawns stay at home in order to allow that. So the important point here is as you're learning these openings, whether you're learning it from a book or from your different studying things in games and databases, try to be aware of all the plans that are in your opening. And then at some points you're going to have to choose between one or the other. For example, I don't play this variation in particular, even though it's a very good variation to play because I choose a different type of plan with the rook to e8 development. So it's just one's not necessarily better than the other. Of course, Kasparov was always on top with his openings, but sometimes it's also a matter of preference and style, as well as maybe which ideas you can understand a little better. And I always think you should play openings that you understand, and even if they're not necessarily the cream of the crop openings right away. And I've talked about that before. Anyways, let's get back to the game, but I just wanted to point that out to you. Okay, so g6 is played, and white plays e3, ready to develop this bishop. And here we have bishop to f5, and then white plays bishop to d3, and black takes, and then we take back with the queen. Now, so by eliminating this light square bishop, as I mentioned before, in this structure, they call the Carlsbad structure, one of the main strategies for white is to play this minority attack, where he will push the b pawn and then eventually trade it for this pawn, and it'll leave. And after the recapture, it will leave a weak pawn here on c6. And I think I've shown you some games where white can attack that down to c-file or plant a knight on c5, for example. But now that black has traded off this bishop, the bishop was one of the supporting this b pawn push is no longer there. But just as again, this just talking more about the complexity of the strategy. There are some variations within the Queen's Gambit Declined where the bishop goes to d7 in order to protect the pawn on c6 and is not traded off. And so one of white's strategies is to trade off the light square bishop as well. So of course, chess is a complex game, but it kind of goes both ways. So, anyways, let's see how Kasparov does this here. Okay, bishop to e7, relieving this pin on the knight, and white castles, and black castles as well. Okay, now b4 is played. So again, the plan is to play b5, and black's going to strike first here, looking to trade off these bishops potentially, as well as putting a knight here. Now, in some variations, as we've seen, and if the bishop is still on e3, white has to be very careful here. But then, typically, what happens is there's usually a rook on e8, and then these bishops are exchanged, and then the rook and the queen are supporting the e4. So, anyways, again, you might want to refer to some of the other videos where I played this variation. So, but here, we're attacking this bishop, we're attacking this knight, and this knight is well placed here. If white were to take, then we would take back here, and then after the queen takes, then we win here. Okay, of course we won a piece. So of course white's not going to take, and if he takes here on e7, then we take back with the queen, and again, now it's impossible to dislodge this knight because of this fork. Okay, so white plays bishop to f4, keeping this bishop. It's fairly useful here. And now black takes. Okay, now white takes on c3, but Giddens in his book and a couple of other commentators I've read, a couple other analyses, suggest that white should take here first. Then after the queen takes, take here. And material will be even, but now we're left with this knight versus this bishop. And as we'll see later in the game, the knight here that was exchanged, very important. So maybe it would have been good. So, but in hindsight, if you look at this bishop, especially if this bishop gets here to d6, aiming this way, it's not so bad either. So I guess I wouldn't say that white has a huge positional victory by trading this off. But based on the results of the game, as we'll see, maybe it was a better move to make. Okay, but in any case, let's go back to the game. White does take on c3. And now black goes to trade off these pieces. And we'll see where the knight becomes very strong. Okay, bishop takes on d6, and instead of taking with the queen, black has a little finesse here, and a very instructive one. He forks the queen and the bishop with his knight, and after his queen moves, of course, because he doesn't want to get his queen captured, now he takes back with the knight, and you can see here that this knight, very nice on d6, and is also covering this square here. So now this minority attack is it's very difficult to get this through. Okay. Uh, White continues on though with a4, looking to support minority attack here, and then black defends here with a6. So all very common stuff with this interplay here with this minority attack. Knight to 5, and so again now we're looking at it's obviously a very nice post here, but putting pressure here on c6. Okay. Black plays his rook to 8 onto this half-open file, and we're going to see some action here shortly. The rook comes also here. So part of this, and I'm not sure how deeply both sides calculated, but I think just having the experience in these openings, we see that e3 also becomes a key square for action. So bringing this rook here is maybe a prophylactic move to look at that, and also maybe in some lines look to play e4 as well. Okay, the queen comes over here to g5, and now again overlooking the king side now, and as Kasparov is known as a great attacking player, of course he was very good at all phases of the game, but we will see some of that style as we come here, and we can see here that in the queen's gambit decline, the pawns here are kind of white's action. He has more space on the queen side, so he wants to play this minority attack and attack these pawns on the queen side, and this is actually very typical. Black wants to get some action in here on the king side because that's where black potentially has more space. Okay, now white plays h3, and Giddens in his book gave this a dubious mark. And the idea, as you'll see, is that it creates a hook for um, for black to attack white's position. So whenever you see a pawn weakness, so for example, whenever one of these pawns around the king are advanced, it gives the other player something to latch onto. Now, in black's case, having played g6, the problem, of course, is that white's pieces are not positioned to attack on the king side, so it's not really that big of a deal. But here with h3, it is a little bit of an issue, as we'll see going here. Now, of course, sometimes, again, chess is a game of weighing the pros and cons of various actions. So it's not the case that should never push the pawns around your king, but you always have to be aware of your opponent's chances. Okay, so black moves his king up, and could be for a bunch of reasons. Could be looking to swing these rooks over here to the h file, for example, but also, as we'll see later in the game, this could be general preparations for later in the game. One of the things that impressed me about not just this game, but in general, Grandmaster play, and Kasparov, you'll see this in a lot of his games, is as much as he's an attacking player and he always plays with the initiative, he's also very patient when it comes to uh, preparing his attacks. And you can see that all the way back to players like Morphy and Alyekin. They're very methodical. It wasn't just not like the romantic players of just throwing every piece out and hoping that an attack or using your great combinative vision in order to see these things. Just building up that attack. And it's something that's something you should look for in the games and look to do in your own games. Okay, let's see. Let's keep going here. So white plays as queen to c2, looking a couple purposes behind this. Partly kind of overseeing, maybe being able to swing back over to the king side to defend, as well as if we can get this minority attack off, and this kind of eyeing this c6 pawn. Okay, so black brings his rook up to the third rank, and specifically he's going to plan to double on the e file here. Okay, white building up pressure on the c file. So both players following pretty good principles of putting your pieces, your major pieces here on the half open files. Okay, black brings his rook over, and now the queen scoots back over here, perhaps looking to support this d pawn. Okay, black plays queen to h5 here, and making way for this g pawn, basically. Uh, White plays to b3, and here it's difficult because white cannot play b5 because there's just too much. He's just going to lose a pawn in that exchange with this knight here on d6. So he's kind of biding his time here, moving his queen back and forth, because he doesn't really, his rooks are pretty optimally placed, and his knight doesn't really have anywhere better to go. So there's not much progress that white can make, seemingly, because he's waiting for maybe black to move his knight or do something so that he can see where to react to. Black plays f6, kicking the knight out of that outpost, and the knight goes back 3. Okay, here comes the kingside attack here with g5. And now white comes to try to exchange queens, kind of alleviate some of the pressure, but then black brings his queen back to g6. Okay, white puts his queen back on c2, looking to exchange queens at some point as well. And here, black plays his rook back 7. Now, very minor move, but there's an important point behind it. Okay, the reason why that rook move is important is that black wants to play g4 at some point. And let's just, for example, if you were to do it right now, then white has this fork here with knight to f4. After queen takes c2, white can get this in-between check in. Knight takes e6 check, and after black captures, white captures the queen, and now white is up the exchange. So that's what is threatened, and in order to prepare g4, you need to avoid that fork, and hence we drop our rook back. Okay, now let's keep moving. Rook e to d1, and now h5. Continuing on, he's going to be advancing his e and h pawns. Queen to c1. Oh, I'm sorry, queen to b1, and h4. Okay, and pretty standard advance. The idea here is that we don't want to play g4 first because then white can close it up with h4. So h4 by black fixes this h pawn in place. Okay, queen comes back to c2 again. White is kind of trying to bide his time, trying to find the opportune moment. The g5 pawn, as you can see, also covers the f4 square, which is why this knight right now can't really do too much. So that's why just kind of shuffling these pieces around. Black plays g4, and white, of course, if white takes, then black can take with the queen, and it just opens up this h file, which doesn't seem like a great idea. It doesn't lose right away, but obviously black has a big attack, and not a good idea to open that up by taking the pawn. Instead, white plays knight to f4, and then black here exchanges queen. Now, the big question here is, well, doesn't black have a big attack coming on the king? So shouldn't we avoid trading these queens? And I would say, oftentimes that is good advice. But in this particular position, black actually sees that his end game with the queens off the board is also going to be superior. And Kasparov was very good at this, but of course, these top grandmasters and world champions know when it's appropriate to transform the position. So even though black has this big attack on the king's side, he's willingly uh, changing the nature of the position because the resulting phase of the end game is also going to be winning for white. So black takes on c2, and white takes back. And the point behind this, or the big move here, is g3. And what does g3 do? Well, we're undermining this e3 pawn. As I mentioned earlier in the video, in a lot of variations, a lot of games in the Queen's Gambit decline exchange variation, there's going to be this pressure on e3. So this pawn move just kind of highlights that. In some analysis, for example, if white were to take here, then you just take back with the h pawn, and we could see that there's no defense here. If white even gets his check in, for example, then the king just moves up. And after he takes that pawn, we take this pawn. And you can see here that the white pawns are a lot weaker. There's really no way that black is going to get at, or I'm sorry, that white is going to get at these pawns here, while black rook and this knight are going to just kind of win these pawns along the way. So that is the idea behind that. So white does not want to take on g3. Instead, he defends his 3 pawn. And over the next few moves, just kind of watch this, and if you want to look at the game and play this over after, just kind of look at this tension here with f2 and e3, and hopefully you can appreciate just how strong these masters are who play these moves. Okay, black now calmly, coolly, just brings his king over to the king side. In the end game, we want to centralize our king, bring it to the action, and seeing that he pretty much is total control, Kasparov does that with his king. Okay, white tries to do similarly, bring his king towards the center of the action, and then black plays king to 5. Okay, white brings his knight back, now threatening to win this pawn here, but what black plays this knight to c4 and attacking 3 again, and then of course if we have this exchange here, black is going to win the exchange because of this fork on e3. For example, if white were to take, then we would just get this knight check, and we would win the exchange. Okay. Of course, white did not do that, and instead defended the e3 pawn again with this rook. And unfortunately, this allows a one-move tactic here with knight b2, attacking the rook on d3, and after the rook moves, black just wins a pawn for nothing. So you can already see here, black is in total control of the game, and just because it's impossible to take this g3 pawn without losing material, that really is where the grip is, because white's pieces are all trying to defend this e3 pawn, and black's knight can just hop over and win this pawn over here. Okay, so white shuffles his rook, trying to stay here in contact with the e3 pawn, of course, and black just maneuvers his knight back. It's coming back to c4. Okay, knight to g1, and here we go. Knight to c4 again. You can see this c4 point. This is one of the negatives of this minority attack. It leaves this c4 hole. Now, if white had his light square bishop, he might be able to contest it, but he doesn't. Earlier, black exchanged that bishop earlier in the game. Okay, knight comes to f3, checking here, and black just moves and stays in protection of the h4 pawn. Okay, the rook comes back here again to the third rank to protect this e3 pawn. And the reason why, by the way, is if he doesn't protect it, then black, it's always a tension with black threatening to take on f2 and then take on 3. So he had to come back to protect. And now black again, because he has such a grip here on the king side, decides he wants to open the a file and get his rooks activated over there. So he plays a5. Now, if white were to push, then black gets a lot of initiative here with a4. And let's say rook to b4, then a3, because knight is protecting it. This rook drops back to stop it. You could even play something like a2, and if the rook blockades it, we have our rook here on a8. And it's a lot of pressure here on threatening to, it ties up white's rook here, and eventually I think black would break through. And we can see here too that the knight controls, makes it very difficult for white's other rook to help attack this. Okay, let's get back though. So after a5, b takes a5, and of course the follow-up, see if you can guess it. Rook to a8. Okay, simply supporting that rook. Okay, so we don't want to take here because then white kind of gets a little more, gets to come back a little bit and gets a little initiative with rook to a3. I think it's still winning quite handily because he just returned his rook here, but now white's rook is on the a file. Okay, let's. That's why rook to a8 was better. And rook to e1. Notice that because this rook moved over, this rook can now move. And then rook just takes here on a5. Has nice control here on the a file. And here, rook here on e1, again protecting e3 now from the front instead of on the side here, which also protects this first rank. And b5 secures this knight and secures this pawn so that this rook can also move. Okay? Rook to e2. And rook to a1 check. And the rook has to move back. Then we bring the other rook over. Okay? And here the threat is to play one of the rooks to a2 to attack here. So that's kind of what black's threats are along this a file. Okay, so because of that, white finally has to take here. And after a couple exchanges, rook takes e1, check. King takes e1, rook to a1, check. 2. Then simply taking the pawn here on g3 again is winning. So let's see how the rest of this game goes. It's pretty straightforward, but we'll just see how Kasparov finishes it off. Okay, knight to e1, looking to redeploy here to e3 or c2, for example. Okay, rook to a2 check. King goes to d1, and we get this check in. Rook to d2 check. King goes to c1. And then here we're forking the knight and the pawn. King has to come back to protect the knight, and black simply wins another pawn. So we can see here, 5 pawns to 3. Black is ahead here. Now there are some tactics and some exchanges here, but you'll see that it leaves black in total control. Okay, the rook takes, and we have this check. Knight takes e3 check, king to e2. Now the knight attacking the pawn on d4, and white defends it. And so now we're going to attack this pawn. And instead of trying to defend it, white just goes after black's pawns. So we have knight takes g2, and then the king attacks it first. Attacks the knight first, going for the e3 pawn. So white backs out with knight to h4 check, and after we take that pawn, we're going to win the d4 pawn with this fork. Knight to f5 check. Kind of going quickly here because pretty straightforward. So I just want to kind of go through and show you these moves. And the knight takes. King goes here to e3, attacking the knight again, and then the knight just backs out with this check. Problem here, of course, after the king moves. Let's say here. Well, here white resigned, because after king moves, then black can defend this pawn here, and it's 4 pawns. This pawn's going to fall. No more chances. So let's go back and just review a couple of the key points behind this game. Very instructive. Even though Kasparov was a master tactician and attacker, we can see that he was also very skilled at positional play, as all the world champions were, but a very impressive show and very instructive in how we play against a minority attack. Okay, our first instructive point here is that importance of that knight on d6 when fighting against a minority attack. As you can see here, the pawn on b4 is already on b4 here, so this c4 square is very vulnerable to this knight. And also from d6, we're covering the b5 square, which makes it very difficult for white to play b5. So first point there in fighting against a minority attack is having this knight here, especially, as we saw during the game, especially if black is able to exchange light square bishops. Okay, the second instructive piece from this game that I wanted to review was just a general idea of the pawn structures and where you should be attacking. And you may have seen this in other books or videos, but here in the Queen's Gambit Decline, for example, the general idea for black is to attack on the king side, and the indicator here is what they call the pawn pointing rule, which I guess was a lot of people attribute it to international master Jeremy Silman in his writing. But the idea here is that the pawns are pointing towards the king side here, and so therefore that's usually where this side will attack. And you can see these different color. The pawns for white are pointing this way, so white's play is on the queen side. So that's another point I didn't mention as much during but it has a lot to do with space and piece activity, as you can see as well. It's a general rule, and something you want to think of, especially in these openings where there's a lot of locked pawns or pawns that are in contact in the center, because that will kind of give you a clue as to where maybe you should be directing your forces. Okay, and the final point I want to review today is just to be aware of what part of the game you're in, what your plans are, and being able to assess whether to transition to the next phase. So in this example, black, Kasparov was not afraid to transition into a winning endgame, even though he had a very direct attack on the king that looked like it was had some potential as well. Simplifying into an endgame or avoiding that simplification are things you need to think about as part of your strategy in chess. So I just wanted to cover that as our final review point for today. Hey guys, thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please hit that like button and let me know what you thought in the comments. If you are new to Better Chess Training, this channel is about helping you improve your chess. If that's something you're trying to do, consider subscribing and turn on those notifications so you'll know when the next video comes out. Finally, just want to thank my patrons for their support. I really appreciate it. If you want to check out my Patreon page and see if you would like to support the channel, you can go to the link in the description below, and all patrons can access annotated PGN files of the games. I usually put them up within a couple days of publishing the video here on YouTube. So check that out, and looking forward to seeing you in the next video.